How does the most powerful armored weapon of World War II grind to a halt? Not from an enemy shell, but from an empty fuel tank. Picture a 70-ton King Tiger rolling through frozen pines, metal teeth bared, engine growling like a beast, and then silence. No shell, no ambush, just a needle stuck on E. It's ugly. It's human. It turns the poetry of courage into the arithmetic of gallons. In the Ardennes, bravery meets supply lines, and one tiny oversight can stop history cold. In this video, we'll follow that pause the moment a war machine runs dry and what it reveals about winning wars. December 1944, deep in the frozen Ardennes. A 70-ton monster moves like a predator through the trees. The German Tiger II, the King Tiger. Its hull is a slab of steel, its long 88mm gun, a needle that points the way. Its tracks chew the snow and leave a ribbon of churned ice behind. The engine is a low, hungry growl, a sound that makes the wood seem smaller. Inside, a cramped crew watches the instruments and the road ahead, convinced that this iron colossus can punch any line open and someone at the front is ready to push it. At its head strides the ambitious SS Colonel Joachim Peiper, cool, driven, and convinced speed will win the day. He isn't a background staff officer, he's the man on the muzzle of the spear, the one ordered to ram Hitler's last, desperate gamble straight into the Allied lines. The Ardennes is his theater, the Tiger tanks his instruments, and the mission is simple and brutal. Punch through, cross the Meuse, seize Antwerp. Peiper moves like a man who believes momentum is destiny, and behind that conviction marches a highly trained, tightly controlled force, ready to turn his bold gamble into a decisive strike. They were not just a unit, they were an armored fist, concentrated and terrifying. Almost 5,000 hand-picked men, SS troopers hardened on the Eastern Front, tank destroyer crews who knew how to hit first and hard, mechanics who could coax life out of welded steel. Behind them rolled a fleet of Germany's best. King Tigers and Panthers, Jagdpanthers and half-tracks, armored cars and assault guns, every vehicle built to punch through defenses and hold ground. Fast, well-led, and brutal in training, Peiper's battle group looked unstoppable on paper, a shock force meant to cleave the Allied line and carry the offensive to Antwerp. Their mission is textbook blitzkrieg: punch a hole through the American lines, drive hard across the Meuse, and seize Antwerp, the single port that keeps the Allied armies fed and moving. Fast columns of tanks and half-tracks, spearheaded by elite SS units, are meant to blast a corridor wide enough to funnel men and materiel straight to the heart of the Allied supply chain. It's bold, it's brutal, and it depends on one brutal truth: speed is everything, because whatever slows them now will doom the entire thrust. But this entire massive operation hides a fatal secret, a vulnerability known to only a handful of staff officers and logisticians, and it changes everything. On paper, Peiper's push looks unstoppable. Armored spearheads, roaring engines, men ready to seize Antwerp. In reality, the whole thing is chained to a single mundane commodity: fuel. Tanks don't charge on courage, trucks don't roll on hope. Every kilometer forward eats gallons, and Germany hasn't brought nearly enough. The plan isn't built on supply lines. It's a gamble to snatch Allied depots as they go. In plain terms, the blitzkrieg is running on fumes, and none of them yet grasp just how close the tank is to stalling. Germany's war machine is dying of thirst. Years of systematic Allied bombing didn't just crimp tanks, it obliterated the industrial heart of Nazi fuel production. Synthetic plants smoked out, oil reserves burned or captured. By late 1944, gasoline was the true lifeblood missing from the front. Factory chimneys stood silent. Rail tanks sat empty. Crews scavenged for whatever jerry can they could find. High Command knew this was a structural collapse, not a temporary squeeze. The offensive was being launched on hope and captured pumps, a gamble that turned brilliant armor into rolling coffins the moment the fuel ran out. Here's the brutal arithmetic. The German High Command launched a massive winter offensive with less gasoline than the Allied armies burned in a single ordinary day. Not a week, not a campaign. One day. After months of targeted bombing, the Reich's synthetic plants and reserves were crippled, and what remained could barely turn a single division's wheels. So Hitler's generals ordered a blitzkrieg-sized gamble, tens of thousands of men, dozens of heavy tanks, built not on supply, but on hope. The hope they could seize Allied fuel as they advanced. Every mile became a countdown, every tank a stopwatch ticking toward an empty tank. They weren't packing extra fuel for a long campaign. The whole operation hinged on one brutal arithmetic: move fast enough to grab the Americans' fuel before they could stop you. It's a gamble built on a prayer lightning thrusts, seizing roadside depots, looting jerry cans and tanks of gasoline as you push toward the Meuse. That meant planning for speed, surprise, and utter ruthlessness. It also meant betting the fate of 70-ton monsters on enemy mistakes. If the depots were gone or torched, the tanks would be beautiful coffins with empty tanks. In short, victory depended less on guns than on getting the next gallon. December 17th arrives, and the gamble collapses in a heartbeat. Peiper's so-called unstoppable Tiger II, the pride of the Third Reich, 70 tons of armored menace sputters, coughs, and dies. Not a shell, not a mine, an empty tank. The crew stares, disbelief and cold biting harder than any enemy. Around them, the spearhead loses momentum. A roaring juggernaut becomes a silent monument to a war choking on its own lack of fuel. All along the advance, the steel spearhead grinds to a halt. One tank sputtering becomes many. Engines cough, clatter, then go quiet. Tracks stop carving the snow. Radios fall silent. What had looked unstoppable stalls into a frozen line. Men climb out and stare at idle guns, knowing the offensive is no longer movement, but a stationary target, exposed in the white. A cold, creeping desperation spreads through Peiper's columns like frost through wool. Engines cough and die. Crews tap empty gauges and peer into spent fuel drums as if they might be hiding a miracle. The thunder of the spearhead goes mute, and strategy collapses into a single question: where's the next jerry can? Men argue over every drop. Officers map routes by who can be sacrificed to move. Mechanics cannibalize knocked-out vehicles just to free a fuel line. Faces harden beneath frozen helmets. The weight of Germany's war rests on blisters and bladders, and for the first time, they feel utterly, terrifyingly paralyzed. Then, a seeming miracle. A scout car pops out of the trees and into the village of Honsfeld, and over the radio comes a single, unbelievable report. An American supply point abandoned. No guards, no artillery. Just quiet drums and stacks of cans waiting under the snow. For a moment, the whole line holds its breath. Desperation loosens into disbelief, then into a raw, electric hope. Men who minutes before were scraping engines with empty tanks exchange looks that could have been laughter. Peiper orders a cautious advance, because in a war run on fuel, an undefended depot is either salvation or a trap. They pour into the compound like a tide boots crunching on frozen earth, flashlights cutting through smoke and frost, and then the sight stops them cold. Row after row of jerry cans, stacked like a metallic harvest, each one sweating condensation, each one full, high octane, ready. For a moment, there's a stunned silence, the kind that comes before a roar. Men slap tanks, pry caps, thread improvised hoses, the sound of metal on metal, like a new kind of prayer. Hands move fast. Hoses snake. Engines are topped up. For these soldiers, in that instant, the offensive lives again a hard, fragrant lifeline. It's a lifeline. The offensive is saved. For a moment, the whole force exhales. Men who had been marching on hope suddenly have barrels and pumps, oil-slicked hands hauling jerry cans, crews bending over tanks, engines coughing back to life. There are whoops, slaps on shoulders, a raw, relieved rush of motion. But Peiper watches from his turret, expression oddly still, as if the prize feels unnervingly fragile. As he watches his men work, a cold, unsettling realization dawns on Peiper. Tanks clank as crewmen wrestle jerry cans into racks. Laughter and shouted orders relief ripples through the column. He should feel triumphant. Instead, there's a hollow in his chest. The Americans had just left this here. Left it casually, like dropping a treasure with a shrug. Not because they couldn't use it, but because they could spare it. The thought hits him like ice. This isn't scarcity. It's abundance, engineered and delivered at scale. He suddenly understands he's not only up against soldiers, but against an entire industrial machine. As Peiper stared at the stacked jerry cans, the first thrill of victory slid into a chill. What felt like a treasure to him was mere trash to the Americans, abandonable, expendable, a line item they could afford to sacrifice. The discovery stopped being a blessing and became a warning. He wasn't up against another army. He was up against an industrial machine that could burn resources to buy time. Suddenly, every proud tank and drilled man looked smaller. Courage counted for less than capacity. The moment pulsed with a simple, terrifying truth. This fight would be decided by who could afford to waste fuel. Then the scale of the problem snaps into focus. In 1944, the United States pumped out 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil, an almost unimaginable prairie of fuel, and all of Germany's production, even counting its much-touted synthetic plants, amounted to less than 2% of that. 2%, put another way, the Reich's entire energy lifeline was a single match next to an ocean of gasoline. Numbers like that aren't just statistics. They rewrite the map of possibility. Peiper's raid wasn't facing a single army anymore. It was trying to outfight a global industrial machine that could pour fuel like water. What hits Peiper in that instant is not a new map or a lost road, but a new frame for the whole war. Those staggering American numbers aren't just statistics. They're an ocean of fuel, an industrial tide that can soak entire fronts and keep rolling. He sees it clearly now. He isn't facing men who can be outmaneuvered. He's facing a nation that manufactures mobility itself. Oil fields, refineries, convoys, pipelines, a logistics machine operating on a different scale. That realization strips the glamour from his armor. Valor alone cannot bridge a continent's supply chain. They didn't just have oil, they had mastered getting it where it mattered. Mile after mile of red ball, express trucks dented, smoking, tire-choked lines thundered across France day and night, drivers chasing schedules like lifelines. Farther back, engineers had built Pluto, an undersea pipeline that quietly pumped fuel from Britain straight to the beaches and depots, a steel artery beneath the waves. Ports, railheads, and airstrips hummed with machine-like efficiency. Fuel was loaded, cataloged, and pushed forward on a timetable the Wehrmacht simply could not match. Logistics, not tanks, had become the decisive weapon. Peiper's officers lay captured shipping manifests on a table, and as he reads the numbers, the room goes quiet. The 50,000 gallons his men cheered over is a drop in the ocean. The Americans aren't scraping by. They're pouring millions of gallons to the front every single day. Not luck, not improvisation, industrial logistics, convoys that never stop, pipelines, planes. What felt like a miracle now feels like a taunt. His small windfall is proof of something bigger. This is a war of production, not brute force. Fueled by those handfuls of captured gas, Peiper's column grinds on towards Stavelot. Fueled by captured American gasoline, Peiper's forces push forward with renewed but grim determination. They grind through snow, through shell-torn lanes, every rumble of treads, a promise and a warning. Weeks of hunger eased by stolen fuel, they claw towards Stavelot. When the town crests the horizon, a hush falls over the column because what waits there could tip everything. They crest the ridge and stop dead, and there it is, the largest American fuel depot in the entire sector. A hulking, glittering sea of gasoline drums and tanker trucks, rows and rows stretching like some obscene metal harvest across the frozen ground. 2 million gallons, the officers whisper, the number ricocheting through the column like a promise. Men shoulder rifles and forget for a beat that the war is guns and maps today. It looks like barrels and brass. For Peiper and his crews, this site is almost sacred. A lifeline in a war run dry, a single find that could turn desperation back into momentum. They crest the ridge and stop, and what they see steals the breath from their throats. Row upon row of drums and tanks, a flat, glittering ocean of fuel stretching to the tree line. For a moment, the war becomes simple math. 2 million gallons, enough to drive them to Antwerp and back, enough to finish what they started. Men laugh, officers calculate routes, drivers run to hose down tanks and twist open caps. But beneath the feverish scramble is a hard, cold question no one wants to voice. This prize is enormous, but can they actually take it before it's gone, or before the enemy makes sure they never will? As they crest the ridge, the Germans expect resistance. Instead, the depot lies oddly quiet. No bunkers, no gun pits. A handful of Americans move among the drum's engineers in oil-stained coats, calm, efficient, led by a Captain Brewster. They bend over spanners and crates, eyeballing manifests, working with a slow, deliberate precision that makes Peiper's men uneasy. This is not the chaotic prize they'd imagined. They aren't digging in their heels or emplacing guns. Brewster's men move like a demolition crew, methodical, cold-blooded, efficient. They snake detonating cord between rows of drums, clamp charges to tank seams, rig timed fuses, and priming lines with the kind of care you'd expect from surgeons, not soldiers. There's no bravado here, only a grim arithmetic. Better a wasteland of fire than a prize for the enemy. Hands work quickly, quietly, faces set. When the last clip is snapped into place, they step back, distance measured, breath held ready for the single command that will turn America's fuel into a wall of flame. As Peiper's lead tanks crest the hill overlooking the depot, Captain Brewster gives the order. He stands among the drums, calm as the engines thunder closer, voice low but absolute. Men snap into motion, hands steady, movements practiced wiring fuses, slapping on primers, sliding safety pins free. For a heartbeat, the world holds its breath. Then the chain of destruction begins. A single grenade arcs into a pool of gasoline. The world erupts. An instant later, a monstrous fireball blossoms. Heat waves ripple through the frozen air, metal shrieks, and men are thrown back by a concussion that rattles their teeth. Fuel drums become rolling infernos. Trucks collapse into flaming hulks. The gray winter light is swallowed as a pillar of flame rockets hundreds of feet, belching black smoke that blots out the sky. For a moment, the whole ridge is a funeral pyre, and the German spearhead watches, helpless, as their path to victory is turned to ash. The explosion gave birth to a monstrous, roaring column, a funeral pyre for Germany's hopes, a black pillar that shot up through the gray winter sky and could be seen for 100 miles. Flames hungrily ate drums and trucks, turning steel into glowing wreckage and painting the world in smoke. For the men who crested that hill, it wasn't spectacle, it was the sound of an entire offensive being erased. In a single, terrible instant, the promise of captured fuel turned to ash, and what followed was a 3-day inferno that consumed the very gasoline that might have carried Peiper to Antwerp. For 3 days the inferno raged, a ravenous column that ate everything the Germans had banked on. Steel drums boiled, wooden pallets turned to kindling, and millions of gallons steamed away into a roaring orange sea. Night became day beneath a sky black with smoke. The sharp cracks of cooking fuel punctured the wind like distant cannon. Each exploding drum was a verdict, a supply line erased in hours, not weeks. Men watched in stunned silence as the lifeblood of their armored spear vanished in flames they could not touch. It was more than lost gasoline. It was the collapse of a plan. Peiper stood on the turret of his command tank and watched the blaze in stunned, profound silence. Columns of flame clawed at the winter sky, not a battle but a condemnation, sheets of fire swallowing drums, trucks, and everything his advance depended on. Heat rolled across the field like a living thing. Soot stung his eyes, and the sharp, chemical smell of burning gasoline filled the air. Around him men moved like shadows, hands that should have been refueling now empty, faces lit orange and hollow. Every roaring second erased the math of the campaign, hours of effort, months of planning, all gone into a pyre visible for miles. The war felt suddenly small and unbearably costly. Peiper stood on his turret, the heat of the inferno on his face. The sky above turned black with smoke, and for a long, stunned moment, no one spoke. Then one of his men, quiet and bitter, turned away from the blaze and said, "They can afford to burn it all just to deny it to us. What are we doing here?" Those few words cut through the roar like a blade. It wasn't just anger, it was the sickening realization that they were up against an enemy who could casually destroy wealth they could only dream of, and that every mile they'd hoped to gain was being measured in gallons they did not have. That question echoes across the Ardennes. The act at Stavelot is not an isolated one. At Spa, American engineers burn another 2.5 million gallons, not in panic but by design, wires and fuses methodically laid among the drums. Flames pour skyward, black smoke becomes a signal, not a catastrophe. To the Germans, it looks like madness, a fortune torched rather than seized. To the Americans, it is arithmetic sacrifice now to deny a desperate enemy later. Each deliberate inferno shrinks Peiper's options until the most fearsome tanks are defeated by something invisible and inexorable: logistics. The fires spread beyond Stavelot and Spa. At Francorchamps they immolated another 1 million gallons, and by the end of that first brutal week, U.S. forces had deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel. It wasn't waste, it was strategy. If you can replace it, deny it. If you can resupply by the thousands of trucks and planes, you don't need to defend every drum. For the men on the ground, it was a sight of impossible scale, rolling seas of black smoke where victory might have been. For the Germans watching, that number would soon stop feeling like logistics and start sounding like madness. To the German High Command, the sight is staggeringly irrational, a deliberate, obscene waste. 8 million gallons, more fuel than they had allocated for the entire offensive. Officers flipped through reports with shaking hands, doing the sums that won't fit with their plans. What looks like a victory turns into a nightmare of arithmetic. This isn't a tactical setback. It's a moral one, proof they are fighting the resources of an entire industrial nation, not just an army. Every drum of gasoline burned is a reminder that their calculus was wrong and that logistics, not courage, may decide the day. To the Americans, it's not madness, it's math and muscle, a calculated denial. If you can replace 2 million gallons in weeks, then destroying a depot to keep it out of enemy hands is a brutal but rational choice. Fuel for them is measured in convoys and pipelines, in factories that never stop, not in every individual can. So they light the fires. They watch mountains of gasoline turn to smoke and know the loss is temporary, the damage inflicted permanent. For the Germans, watching that inferno tells a different story. Resources the Americans treat as disposable are the lifeblood the Wehrmacht cannot afford to lose. And the contrast is now absolute. The contrast is absolute. On one side, a global machine that pours fuel like water. On the other, Peiper's crack troops crawling under the weight of an empty tank. They strip gasoline from wrecked Panthers and half-tracks with garden hoses and tin cups, hands numb, breath steaming in the cold, drifting at the mouth of the tube as if siphoning life itself. Movement becomes inching, 100 yards won with greasy fingers and sheer stubbornness. Where tanks should roar, they whisper. Where tactics should be bold, they are improvised, desperate. In that frozen silence, the illusion of invincibility quietly evaporates. At the same time, American C-47 seconds turned the sky into a lifeline. Hundreds of missions thundered into besieged Bastogne, their canvas bellies spilling precious cargo. Parachutes bloomed over frozen streets as 160,000 gallons of gasoline floated down to the starving 101st Airborne. Where Peiper's men scraped tins, the Americans were literally raining fuel relief delivered by air, relentless and precise. In a single day, American C-47 seconds poured into Bastogne, more fuel than Peiper's entire elite armored division could ever hold, a staggering, humiliating mismatch of supply. The numbers hit like a verdict. While German tanks scrounged for every last drop, the Americans simply flew it in by the ton, feeding a surrounded garrison with enough gasoline to keep them fighting. The effect was immediate and brutal. It wasn't just about machines anymore, it was about will. Men who had prided themselves on shock and speed suddenly understood they were competing with a global factory, and in that realization their morale began to crack. The psychological war was over. Then, on December 20th, the final tactical blow lands. Peiper's tiny resupply convoy, his last hope, is spotted from the air and shredded. Bombs and strafing runs turn trucks into burning hulks. Gas, ammunition, the fragile lifeline gone. His advance stalls, hope evaporates. Surrounded and starving for fuel, his spearhead suddenly looks more like prey than predator. Peiper is trapped, surrounded by a resurgent American army, completely out of gas. The mighty tanks that carved lanes through Europe sit like dead beasts, turrets silent, tracks frozen in the snow. Men crawl from under steel and start siphoning every last drop from wrecks, praying for motion that doesn't come. News arrives that their resupply was annihilated. No fuel, no relief, no plan B. For the first time, the fear on these hard soldiers' faces isn't shellfire. It's the simple, humiliating arithmetic of thirst. They are cut off, exposed, and staring at a horizon that will soon be filled with American planes. 3 days later, the famously foul weather finally breaks. The clouds tear open, blue slashes the gray. From that empty sky comes a roar. Allied air forces, unleashed, pouring over 2,000 sorties into the Ardennes in a single day. It is a metal storm. Fighters and bombers screaming in, flares and rockets carving the tree line, bombs punching makeshift roads to Swiss cheese. Any hope of slipping away evaporates under the thunder. Fuel convoys are hunted. Columns are strafed. Radios go dead. Peiper's men look up and see the sky become the enemy. Escape routes are burned away by horsepower they simply don't have. Cornered and out of options, Peiper raises his hand and gives the order that ends the war machine. Destroy it all. Short, cold words. The crews move like ghosts, puncturing fuel lines, spiking engines, chaining open turrets, smashing optics, every priceless Tiger Panther half-track rendered useless by their own hands. There is no heroism in the work, only grim efficiency, metal and oil sacrificed so the enemy won't drive it away. In the snow and smoke, elite armor becomes scrap. The battlefield goes quiet, except for the dull final sounds of self-inflicted destruction. Millions of dollars of cutting-edge tanks and half-tracks were systematically gutted and left to rot, guns spiked, sights smashed, radiators punctured, turrets jammed, and engines packed with sand. Men set charges to ruin vulnerable systems, crowbars and torches turning masterpieces of engineering into scrap. Not an enemy shell did this, an empty fuel gauge did. It was a practical, bitter decision. Deny the Allies the prize, even if it meant destroying your own strength. Then, with the same quiet efficiency that had driven them forward, the crews slipped into the woods, leaving hulks that would later be found intact enough to run again with just a few thousand gallons. The once proud soldiers of the elite battle group slipped away on foot into the frozen woods, breath steaming in the air, leaving a graveyard of steel. Snow-masked tracks, turret hatches stood open. When American salvage crews reached the vehicle park, they expected wreckage. Instead, they found dozens of perfectly operational tanks, armor unmarred, guns intact, optics unbroken. These machines had been defeated not by shells but by an empty fuel tank. With only a few hours and local reserves they could have been driving again, the men had gone. The verdict was blunt. Bravery could not overcome a lack of logistics. An official American report later recorded the almost farcical detail. To get all 39 abandoned tanks running again would take roughly 8,000 gallons of fuel, the sort they called local reserve, and about 4 hours of work. 4 hours. It was a bureaucratic footnote that read like a verdict. The hulks were not ruined. They were defeated by logistics. In the frozen Ardennes silence, the math was brutal and simple. The one thing Peiper couldn't seize was the one thing his enemies could afford to burn or to fly in. That single line sums up the battle. Today, that King Tiger sits in a small Belgian museum, frozen on the mud-splattered slope where its engine finally died, turret open, tracks stiff with winter grime, a hulking, silent witness. It looks like victory frozen in time, but up close it tells a different story, not of shattered armor or heroic last stands, but of something quieter and crueler, running out of gas. Peiper's finest stopped for lack of fuel, not fire, and that rusting behemoth is now a steel monument to a blunt truth of modern war. Bravery can be flawless and still lose to supply lines. If that surprises you, there's a whole hidden world behind every headline: logistics, fuel, and the small decisions that steer history. Learn more about those unseen forces